All right, so you've given us some fascinating material to delve into today. These study notes you've shared, strategies for church development. I mean, they really get to the heart of, how to build strong and vibrant church communities, right? And that's what we're all about here, figuring out, according to your research, what really makes a church tick, what makes it flourish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These notes, they really hit on some of those like fundamental questions, right? What's the core purpose of a church? How does a church experience, healthy growth? And what are those telltale signs that we're on the right path? I think it's particularly interesting that your source looks at all this, from a missiological perspective.
Yeah, tell me more about that. What does thinking missiologically actually mean in this context?
So thinking missiologically means we're approaching church development through the lens of reaching those who are outside the faith,
Hmm.
really understanding their world, their context, and then, adapting our strategies accordingly. This is why your source really emphasizes the connection to the broader church growth movement, right?
Yeah.
And those key figures like, Roland Allen, Donald McGavran, Eugene Nida, those sorts of folks.
Absolutely. That missiological lens, I think it gives us such a valuable framework to work with. And it brings us to like the central question for this part of our deep dive, right? According to your notes, what are the key differences between healthy and unhealthy church development? What are those like red flags that we should all be aware of?
Well, your source jumps right in,
Mhm.
tackles some of these unhealthy patterns head on. And it's pretty direct in its analysis. One of the first things it addresses is this idea of the numbers requirement. This common idea that a new church needs to hit a certain number of members, maybe like 30, 50. You mentioned some conventions require that before it can be, officially recognized.
Okay, so help me unpack this a little bit. I mean, the intention behind setting a minimum, it probably comes from wanting to ensure stability, right? A solid foundation for a new church.
Yeah, that's the common assumption, right? More members, more strength, more stability. But the crucial insight here is that your source is saying, like, hey, there's actually no biblical basis for this. And even more than that, it argues that these high number thresholds, they can be detrimental. They can choke out a brand new church community before it even has a chance to really get going.
So it could actually backfire, hurt more than it helps.
Yeah, exactly. It can lead to, delayed recognition. It can really stifle the early momentum of a smaller group of believers.
That's fascinating. I mean, you naturally assume a bigger starting group, the more the merrier.
Right. But that's not always the case. And then there's the other side of that coin, right? The failure to distinguish a preaching point from a church. This is where any small gathering, could be a Bible study, anything, is prematurely labeled as a fully fledged church. Your source even points out the misapplication of Matthew 18:20, where two or three gather in my name.
Yeah, that verse, that gets thrown around a lot. So just because you've got a few people meeting to study the Bible, with good intentions, it doesn't automatically mean, boom, you've got a church, right?
Right, exactly. And your source is emphasizing that a New Testament church, it's more than just a gathering, right? It's missing those core characteristics that really define a church community.
Okay, so it's more than just meeting up, more than just good intentions. What's the next unhealthy pattern that your notes bring up?
Okay, so the next one is the property requirement. This idea that, a church can only be legit, can only be recognized if it owns its own land, its own building. And your source is really clear on this. Like there's no record of New Testament churches actually owning property, until well after the time of Jesus and the apostles.
That's a good point. We so often associate churches with those physical buildings, but the early church, they met all over the place, right?
Oh, absolutely. Homes, under trees, by rivers, even in the catacombs sometimes, when there was persecution. The source actually cites Romans 16:5, 1 Corinthians 16:19, Colossians 4:15, all mentioning churches meeting in homes. So, the takeaway here is this idea of a church needing a building. It's a much later development, not a foundational principle.
That's a good reminder, right? It's not about bricks and mortar, it's about the people.
Exactly. Okay, so the last unhealthy pattern in this set is poorly trained leadership. Or, to be more precise, the unbiblical requirement of a formally theologically educated pastor before you can even call it a church.
That's interesting. So are you saying theological education is bad?
No, not at all. What the source points out is that, from what we see in the New Testament, Paul was really the only leader among the early pastors who had formal theological training. So while it's valuable, it shouldn't be a barrier to entry, right?
Makes sense. So it's not about degrees, it's about the calling, the character of the leadership.
Exactly. It's about that genuine spiritual leadership and guidance within that community of believers.
Okay, so we've looked at some of the pitfalls, some of the unhealthy patterns to watch out for. Now let's flip the script and talk about what your notes call the healthy patterns of church development, those characteristics that are rooted in, the New Testament examples. So the first one on the list is body life. What does that concept encompass?
All right, so body life, according to your source, it defines a local church as a living, breathing fellowship of baptized believers, right?
Yeah.
And they're united by the Holy Spirit, and they share this clear purpose: worship, fellowship, witness, nurture, and ministry. And then it breaks this down even further into 5 key characteristics that really show us this body life in action.
Okay, let's hear those 5 characteristics. What makes up this body life?
All right, so first up, support and ministry. We're talking about believers actively caring for each other, serving one another, meeting those practical needs, those spiritual needs within the community. Second, proclaiming Christ. And that's both evangelizing to those who haven't heard the message yet and nurturing the spiritual growth of those who have. Third, self-governance. This means the church has the freedom and the ability to organize itself, to choose its own leaders, really reflecting the agency of the local body. Then we've got regular meetings for those essential practices: worship, fellowship, observing the ordinances, baptism, communion. And lastly, cooperative relationships with other congregations, recognizing that we're all part of the bigger body of Christ.
Right, so it's not just about doing your own thing, it's about connecting with other churches too.
Exactly. We're better together.
That's a great picture of a really dynamic, functioning church community. It's not just, individuals off doing their own thing. It's about being actively connected, engaged with each other. And I think your notes also mention that a recognized church, it can actually lose its status, right? You even reference those churches in Revelation 3. That's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It reminds us that
Mm-hmm.
being a church, it's not like you check a box and you're done.
Mm-hmm.
It's an ongoing thing, right? It requires that continuous spiritual vitality. You got to stick to those core characteristics. And building on this whole body life thing, your source goes even deeper into, like, when does a group actually become a church? It's not just about checking off a list.
Yeah, it seems like there's a deeper transformation that needs to happen. What are the signs that a group has gone from being, say, just a Bible study to an actual church?
Well, your notes outline a few key shifts. First, the group becomes a true spiritual family. They really own each other's problems and needs, providing that support practically, emotionally. Then there's this strong koinonia, this deep spiritual fellowship that goes way beyond just, hanging out. And they start to own the lost in their community. It becomes a shared responsibility. They actively want to share the gospel. And finally, they've organized themselves, at least in a basic way. They've identified a leader or leaders to help them fulfill these obligations, to guide the community.
So it's like they're moving from like a loose gathering to a real community with shared responsibility, a shared mission.
Exactly. And the source makes a point of contrasting this with just a Bible study group or a preaching point or even mission outreach focused on a specific task. Those things are all good, but they haven't quite reached that full-fledged church status. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a different level of commitment, a different level of shared life together. So the next healthy pattern your note to highlight is focus on impacting lost people with the gospel. That seems pretty fundamental to what a church should be about, right?
Oh, absolutely. The source emphasizes that this should be like the top priority for any church, reflecting that initial focus of the church planter, the one who brought the gospel to that community in the first place. And there's a big warning here about churches becoming too inward focused.
And that's something that happens not just in churches, but in a lot of organizations, right? You get so caught up in your own internal stuff, your own members, that you forget about the outside world.
That's exactly it. And your notes point to this trend. In the U.S., around year 7, overseas, around year 10, a lot of churches, they shift from being go-oriented, actively sharing the gospel, to being come-oriented, focused mostly on their existing members. And this decline in reaching out to those who don't know Christ, the source argues it's directly linked to a lack of growth, a decline in the church's overall energy and effectiveness. There's even a reference to Luke 15, 1-7, the parable of the lost sheep.
Yeah. Powerful imagery, right? Even if it's just one lost sheep, the focus has got to be on finding them. And the next point is about focusing on people rather than parish, right? This introduces us to Donald McGavran's homogeneous unit principle. What's that all about?
So McGavran, he noticed that a lot of healthy, growing churches, they were more effective when they focused their outreach on specific people groups. These are groups of people with shared characteristics, cultural, linguistic, social, even economic. It's about being strategic,
Yeah.
right? Instead of just trying to reach everyone within a certain geographical area, which is the traditional parish model, you focus on specific groups.
So it's about knowing your target audience, tailoring your approach to connect with them, right? But your notes are clear that this homogeneity, it's not meant to be the end goal.
Right, that's crucial. It's a starting point, not the finish line. The church, in its fullest expression, should reflect the amazing diversity of the body of Christ, people from all walks of life. So it's a tool, not the whole picture.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Next up is the team approach. This section sounds like it's about leadership, right?
Yeah, it is. And it emphasizes that healthy church growth, it's often fostered by a team-based leadership approach rather than just relying on a single Lone Ranger pastor.
Mm-hmm.
The source points to the early church in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 6, they had this pluralistic leadership structure.
And even though they had multiple leaders, your notes point out that the decision-making in that early church, it was clearly congregational.
Right, right. So it's like a balance, The example in Acts 6, the apostles identified a need, they proposed a solution, but the whole congregation chose who would serve as deacons. So it's shared responsibility, shared input, and that's a really important principle.
And your notes also mention the Apostle Paul, how he consistently traveled and ministered with partners, right?
Yeah, always had his team.
Mm.
So the New Testament clearly points to the value of teamwork in ministry. And there's even a brief discussion about different leadership models in your notes, congregational, Presbyterian, Episcopal.
It seems like there's space for different approaches, right?
Yeah, exactly. The source suggests there's strong biblical support for a congregational approach, but the overarching takeaway here is the value of a team dynamic. It brings more collaboration, more shared responsibility, a wider range of gifts and perspectives.
Okay, makes sense. So on to the next healthy pattern, focus on new units. Sounds like this is about expansion, multiplication, right?
Right on. Your notes say that starting new churches, developing new ministries, these are vital for the health and growth of the wider church. When a church stops planting new churches, stops starting new ministries, things start to stagnate and eventually decline.
So new things bring new life.
Yeah, that's the idea. New units, whether it's a brand new church or a new ministry within an existing church, they tend to grow faster, and they're often more effective at reaching people who aren't connected to a church yet.
That makes sense. You've got that fresh energy, that outward focus, and your notes even mention Arthur Flake and his research on biblical principles of growth, right?
Yeah, Flake, like McGavran, he really dug into the scriptures, looking for those foundational principles for church growth. And the evidence suggests that starting new churches, multiple new churches, has a much bigger impact on reaching lost people than just trying to make existing churches bigger and bigger.
So it's not just about adding more people to the same building. It's about multiplying, spreading out.
Exactly. And this applies at the local level too, starting new classes, new groups, new ministries. It keeps things fresh. It keeps things growing.
That's a great takeaway for any church leader. Okay, next is finding an appropriate location. Seems pretty straightforward, but are there specific things to keep in mind?
Yeah, the location, it might seem like just a logistical detail, but it can have a huge impact on a church's ability to connect with its community, especially those who aren't already part of the church. The source warns against choosing locations on the edges of community boundaries, geographical, economic, social.
So like being in a location that's hard to get to for certain people or that sends the wrong message?
Exactly. You don't want to create unnecessary barriers. And there's also a point about planting in the ethnographic center, especially in situations where the target people group is facing persecution or where there's a very strong dominant culture.
So being at the heart of where those people live, work, and interact.
Right. It helps foster that sense of belonging, that sense of connection. Okay, so the next healthy pattern is focusing the gospel on the worldviews of the people. It seems to be about tailoring your message, right?
Yeah, meeting people where they're at.
That's it. Healthy, growing churches, they make an effort to understand the worldview, the beliefs, values, assumptions of the people they're trying to reach. And then they They present the gospel in a way that directly addresses those specific things, rather than just focusing on, the pastor's own interests or background.
So it's about being culturally sensitive, listening well, understanding your audience, and your notes also warn about syncretism.
Yeah, that's a big one. It's crucial to connect with people where they are, but you can't compromise the core truths of the gospel in the process. It's about finding that bridge, right? Connecting with their understanding while staying true to the message.
Okay, makes sense. So next we have developing and using compatible communication styles. Now this is about how you deliver the message, right?
Exactly. And the source makes this distinction between oral and literate communicators. People who are more oral learners, they learn best through stories, through experience. Literate learners, they often prefer things to be more logical, structured, and effective churches, they recognize this and adapt their communication style.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You've got to tailor your communication to your audience. And your notes give examples, like using chronological Bible storing for those who learn orally, and chronological Bible teaching for those who are more literate.
Yeah, those are just a couple of examples, but the point is to choose a style that will make the message clear and memorable for that specific audience.
All right, makes sense. So next up is discipling every believer. This is about spiritual growth, right? Nurturing the faith of those who are already part of the church.
Absolutely. And the source emphasizes that this is not just an optional extra, it's essential for healthy church growth, It's the engine that drives it all. Without good discipleship, you might get people in the door, but they might not stay or they might not grow. And it highlights the need to develop leaders from within this discipleship pool, and for leaders themselves to never stop being discipled, to always be growing.
So it's a continual process, not just for new believers, but for leaders too.
Exactly. And it emphasizes involving everyone, every member, in service, using their gifts.
Mhm.
This is a key part of closing the back door, preventing people from drifting away and building that culture of everyone serving, everyone participating.
Okay, that's a great point. And the next pattern is ministering to people's needs. This seems to be about practical outreach, engaging with the community, right?
Right on. The source talks about this shift in how people view church. They're not just going out of obligation anymore. They're looking for answers. They're looking for help with real-life problems. So effective churches, they go out and they assess the needs of their community, and then they develop ministries to meet those needs.
So it's not just about preaching, it's about practical action, meeting real needs. And there's this interesting cautionary example in your notes about family ministry units and how they sometimes actually reduced outreach.
Yeah, so the idea is sometimes these family life centers, they were meant to be welcoming to newcomers, but they ended up mostly being used by existing members for their own activities. And that actually pulled those members away from the broader community, where they would have had more natural opportunities to connect with people who weren't yet part of the church.
So it's like they unintentionally built a wall around themselves.
Kind of, yeah. And it's a reminder that we need to constantly evaluate our ministry strategies. Are they actually reaching the people we're aiming for?
Absolutely. Good point. Okay, so moving on to praying without ceasing. This is about that spiritual foundation, right? The power of prayer in church growth.
Absolutely. And the source highlights the example of South Korea after 1960, where there was this huge church growth explosion. And a lot of people attribute that to the widespread practice of early morning prayer meetings.
So people were coming to these prayer meetings and finding Christ.
That's it. A lot of them weren't even Christians when they started coming. They were just looking for help, looking for answers. And your source makes the point that prayer, it's not just a side thing. It's absolutely crucial for church growth in any context, anywhere in the world.
That's a powerful reminder. We can't forget about prayer. And next we have mobilizing the laity. So this is about empowering the everyday members of the church, right?
Yeah, getting everyone involved. Growing, healthy churches, they equip their lay members for ministry. They don't just rely on the professional clergy to do everything. It's about moving away from that clergy-dominated model where the majority of people just sit and listen.
Right. Everyone has a role to play. And your notes even mention bivocational pastors, those tent makers like the Apostle Paul.
Yeah, and it points out that for the Russian Orthodox Church, bivocational pastors are actually seen as the norm, not the exception. And that's pretty interesting, right? It challenges our Western assumptions.
It does, and it seems like there's room for both, right? Full-time pastors and those who also have other jobs.
Exactly. Both are important. Both contribute to a healthy church.
Okay, so moving on to developing relevant worship styles. This is a big one. A lot of churches are wrestling with
Oh,
this.
for sure. And the source acknowledges that, worship style matters to people today.
Yeah.
It influences where they choose to go to church. But it also cautions against churches becoming just entertainment centers, style over substance.
So it's a balancing act, right? Being engaging, relevant, but without losing the core message.
Exactly. The message always has to come first. And your notes mention the value of variety in worship as well.
Yeah, appealing to different people, different preferences.
Right. And next we have developing stewardship. So now we're talking about finances, right?
Yeah, the money stuff, always important.
It is. And your source warns against churches becoming too reliant on outside funding, especially over the long term. While some initial support can be helpful, being too dependent on it can actually hinder a church's growth, its ability to become truly self-sufficient.
So it's about teaching people to give, to support their own church.
Exactly. Fostering that sense of ownership, that sense of responsibility.
Okay, and next we have developing and choosing discipled leaders. Sounds like we're circling back to the importance of discipleship.
We are. And this point, it really hammers home that link between a strong culture of discipleship and effective leadership. The source talks about this leadership and discipleship deficit that exists in many churches, where there are more people in leadership positions than there are people being actively discipled.
So you end up with leaders who haven't been properly equipped, properly mentored.
That's the risk, yeah. And it can really hinder a church's growth. Healthy, sustainable leadership, it flows out of that strong discipleship culture.
Okay, that makes sense. Next up is developing a process, not a program. What's the difference?
So this principle, it emphasizes that it's more important to have a flexible, adaptable approach to church growth than it is to just copy a specific program that works somewhere else. Studying successful programs is good, but they work best when they're adapted to the local context, the specific needs of the community.
So it's about understanding the principles behind the program, not just blindly copying what someone else did.
Right. You need to understand the why, not just the what.
Makes sense. And finally, we have planning for future growth. Seems pretty self-explanatory, right?
Yeah, it is. It's about being intentional, about thinking ahead. Healthy churches, they monitor their past growth, they evaluate what worked, what didn't, and they use that information to make plans for the future.
So it's about learning from experience, adapting, and always looking forward. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here, those unhealthy patterns, the healthy patterns, and it seems like from your notes, the key is that all these things, they work together, right?
They do, yeah. Your source really emphasizes that these building blocks, they're most effective when they're seen as a whole, not as isolated strategies. It's a holistic approach.
It's all connected, and there's also this interesting point about the lifespan of churches. You know, the reference to the 7 churches in Revelation.
Yeah, the source reminds us that individual churches, they're not necessarily meant to last forever in their current form. Those 7 churches in Revelation, they don't exist anymore, at least not in the same way.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they failed. They served their purpose.
So it's not about longevity. It's about fulfilling your purpose however long that takes.
Exactly. Their season ended, but their impact ripples through history.
And what would you say, based on your notes, is the ultimate purpose of a church? What are they aiming for?
The source is clear, that it's not about achieving some kind of, perfect state, some flawless ideal. It's about reflecting the character of Christ. It's about nurturing believers. It's about reaching the lost. And it's about giving birth to new churches.
Those are great goals to strive for. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to chew on. We've talked about all these principles, these healthy patterns, and I want you to think about how these ideas might apply not just to churches, but to any group you're part of, any organization, any community that wants to grow, that wants to make a difference in the world. What are those core elements of healthy development, that outward focus that really resonate with you? As always, we appreciate you joining us for this deep dive, and we hope it's given you some food for thought.